Hello, welcome to the self-learning platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we start Unit 5, Types of War, Conventional War, Limited War, and Nuclear War. And we start with Conventional War in Nuclear Age. Conventional warfare has witnessed three important watersheds in its evolution during the last 300 years. The first generation warfare reflected the tactics of era of the smooth-bore musket, the tactics of the line and column. These tactics were a product of the technology of the days. The line maximized the fire power. The second generation warfare was a product of the rifle's musket, breech loaders, barbed wire, machine gun, and indirect fire. Tactics were based on the ability of movement that the new technology provided. There was an increased reliance on artillery in the second generation as compared to the infantry that had been the mainstay of the first generation. Firepower had replaced manpower. The third generation warfare continued to use the technological base of the earlier period. Its reliance on massive firepower continued to become more sophisticated with better technology. The real change in the third generation came in the concepts and ideas of warfare. The Germans, for example, developed radically new tactics based on maneuver rather than attrition. The Blitzkrieg is one classical example. Today we are entering into the fourth generation warfare methods. This era is likely to see the battlefield include the entire society rather than the restricted battlefield of the earlier generations. It would also see a decreased dependence on centralized logistics. The military machine is likely to be leaner and technologically sophisticated as compared to the mass armies of the earlier days. Another important tactical change in the efforts made at collapsing the enemy internally rather than defeat in an all out war. This warfare will see an advance in both ideas and technology. It is in the late 1950s that a perception about the status of conventional war in the age of nuclear weapons starts to become more articulate. The Americans and the French were frustrated with their experiences in the East. The British were equally frustrated in their attempts to retain influence in the Middle East. The growth of national liberation struggles and the spread of the anti colonial movements had an impact on the perception of the Western powers. This was further complicated by the overt and covert support that these movements received from the Soviets and the Chinese. The British position was that large forces raised through conscriptions on the lines of the World War experiences had now become obsolete. Military forces of the day were not meant to win wars but to prevent them. The campaigns of the earlier days and the concept of total war were no more relevant today. Riddled Hart was to argue that if war could not be prevented by deterrence, it was haste kept limited so as to avoid total destruction. Henry Kissinger had argued that a nation's military strength was to be employed to support its policy. He had favored the concept of limited nuclear wars, but eventually argued in favor of limiting the scope of war. American policies regarding nuclear war and the strategies designed to tackle the Soviet threat were to evolve over the years. These are discussed in great detail in the section on nuclear war. Andre Murphy, in his book Introduction to Strategy, has listed five choices of total strategy. He advocated that the West pursue a total strategy that would embrace the political, economic, and diplomatic activity backed by the threat to use force or the actual use of it. The five choices were as follows. Direct threat may be employed when one has ample resources and objective is not of overwhelming importance. Such a threat may be exercised by a nuclear power on a non-nuclear power, though in reality this may not be practicable, as was seen in Korea. The second choice is of indirect pressure. This is used when the objectives are of relatively less importance and the resources available to exert a threat are also not adequate. This is done by a sustained diplomatic, political, and economic pressure, backed by the threat of use of force. Befree cites Hitler's example in this regard. The third choice is a series of successive actions, a nibbling process against one's adversary. The perception here is that the resources available are relatively less and an all out action may be suicidal. A low intensity protracted struggle that is long drawn is the fourth choice. The revolutionary wars of the Third World have used this strategy. Mao's approach to war may be one of the best examples in this context. Here, there is a recognition that the resources are really limited and that they have to deal with the adversity in a low intensity conflict and not with a direct confrontation. Finally, there is a choice of an all out battle. The aim is military victory. The presumption is of total force superiority, and here the fear of nuclear confrontation or risk does not exist. Bufre maintained that the objective of strategy was to achieve and maintain freedom of action and to try to limit that of the enemy. The Soviet position after the 1917 revolution was influenced by ideological debates of the time. The need of the time was to disciplined, trained, professional army, but this went against the fundamentals of the revolution that called for a proletariat army. Eventually, the urgency of the need of the hour prevailed, and Czarist officers were called back into service. The Soviet view of conventional war has traditionally stressed on the utility of offense as the best form of strategy. The ability and the willingness to take the offensive in order to preempt the enemy had been a consistent theme in Soviet thinking. Until Stalin was alive, the traditional concept as symbolized by the Great Patriotic War continued to dominate. Nuclear weapons did not seem to alter this perception. The Soviet concept of strategic culture is used to discuss specific national approaches. It is grounded in geopolitical and historical circumstances. It views the Soviet Union as having faced aggression over past several centuries and today being surrounded by hostile powers. Now we want to wind up this lecture. Thank you so much for your attention.